Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Code and the Coding Coders Who Code It. I'm your host, Drew Bragg, and I'm joined today by Joel Hawksley. Joel, I'm sure that many listeners don't need an introduction to you, but for those who do, could you please briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me on the show. My name's Joel. I'm an engineer at GitHub. I've been here for over 7 years now. I've worked on a bunch of different things at the company, most notably creating the ViewComponent framework, of which I've remained the lead maintainer since, late 2018. I've also done a lot of work on accessibility, spent a couple years working on that. And most recently, a couple months ago, I joined the Ruby architecture team. Really cool opportunity to work on Ruby and Rails on behalf of GitHub.
Yeah, that is awesome. The way this is going to work is I'm going to ask Joel 3 questions, and they're going to be awesome. Based on his little intro there, I'm going to ask him what he's working on, what kind of blockers he has. If he doesn't have a current blocker, he can talk about a recent blocker he had, how he got around solving it, things like that. And then the last question, what is something cool, new, or interesting that he's learned or discovered? It could be related to being on the new Ruby architecture team at GitHub, but it sounds like we have a lot to get into, so I don't want to yammer on for too long. Joel, what are you working on?
So the big news of what I'm working on is the next major release of ViewComponent, which will be the 4th major. The previous major was V3, which was a couple years ago. Ironically, similar timing in my life. I was expecting my first child when we were working on the 3rd major, and my wife and I are now expecting a 2nd child, which has kind of forced my hand to work on the 4th major.
Congratulations. Yeah. Sounds like you'll be having your 3rd child when we get the 5th major of ViewComponent. So an early congratulations there.
Thanks.
So as of today's recording, June 30th, I don't quite know when this episode's going to go out yet, but as of June 30th, release candidate 1's out, and there's a pretty long list of various changes, bug fixes, breaking changes, etc. But the one thing that caught me a little bit, first thing that jumped out at me, is sort of the phrasing of the release sort of makes it sound like you're done, not with maintaining view components, but it's feature complete. It's a mature gem, and you don't have a ton of future plans for it. Can you talk a little bit about where you are with view components?
I think you described it well. It's wild to see something you created that you had an idea for on an airplane years ago go through all the stages of maturity, including long-term support. And that's where we're at, which is me and Cameron and Blake and Simon and Hans, the core maintainers of the framework, have kind of all reached this general agreement that the project has been feature complete actually for a little while. We kind of took a step back as I was starting to talk about going on paternity leave to talk about what the next steps were for the project, and realized that we hadn't seen a lot of major changes. We hadn't seen a lot of proposed breaking changes. And I think that's a great sign. There were a ton of changes early on in the project. We had some significant changes, say, to the slots API in V3 that were not hugely fun to make, let alone migrate in the GitHub code base and in other people's code bases. But I think it's time. I think that it's good for projects to reach this kind of level of long-term support. You see it in other projects as well. And I think that we are certainly there.
What's something that could change, whether it be with view components, underlying architecture, or if it's a change in Rails? Like, is there anything that you have in your head, like, we're feature complete, we're mature? However, if this thing happens, or this idea or this concept comes around, we would need to start working on V5.
As part of going through this V4 cycle, I was fortunate enough to have the last 3 months full-time with almost no meetings to work on this project. This release isn't just about doing a major breaking change. Actually, for me, it's about putting the whole project in a long-term support mode. And that involved reviewing and resolving every single discussion, issue, and pull request on the project, which was a massive amount of work. Apologies to everyone out there that I neglected. Apparently, discussions weren't notifying me, so I didn't see a lot of them. Anyways, they weren't on my radar, especially when I wasn't able to focus on the project as much.
If only there was someone you knew who worked at GitHub that could fix that.
Well, and what I think it is that I think that when we first introduced discussions, the notification setup maybe was more opt-in. And I think that we changed it maybe a couple of years ago to be opt-out. So there were a lot of older discussions that I hadn't participated in. I also know that I was at reduced capacity for other reasons for a couple of years. Anyways, in going through that process, it was pretty clear to me that there were a couple key themes that have yet to be addressed by the framework. And the biggest one is CSS and JavaScript architecture. And in fact, we had documentation on the framework website for different ways of doing CSS and JavaScript. And as part of the V4 release, we're removing all of it because no one could agree on it. It went out of date super fast. So it just wasn't really serving to have this part of our documentation. But I think that speaks to an opportunity in the future, as you asked about. Because as I'm sure you've seen in your career, there has been so little consensus on how things are done in that space. And people come asking to the project how should I do my CSS? How should I do my JavaScript? We don't even have one answer in the GitHub code base. We're making great progress on it, getting towards something that we feel is more durable in the long-term sense. But even then, I don't think our approach is applicable to a small Rails app. And that's kind of a philosophical corner you end up painting yourself into when you are building something that is so Rails adjacent, like ViewComponent, that's just meant to be like a plugin that you pull in and just feels like another layer you put on top of Rails. It just should have been there all along. It's really hard to have an opinion about something that is changing so much when you are in that spot.
Rails itself essentially went through that. It was Webpacker. This is how we're going to do JavaScript, and CSS going forward. This is the way. And then it was okay, actually, the people in the JavaScript space just change this shit every other month. We can't keep up, and we don't want to keep up. So instead, we're just going to kind of let you do your own thing and give you the access to you do whatever you need to do, whatever works best for you and your team, and we'll just adapt for that. So I think Rails went through that a little bit. So it makes sense that ViewComponents would kind of take the same approach.
Right. And I think that what is especially difficult is that ViewComponent is as much a mental model as it is a framework, which is to say that we're trying to help you think like you would think as a React developer. And I think that what people crave in the CSS and JavaScript side of things is the ability to think like they are in React when they are not. And from a rendering markup standpoint, that was not hugely difficult to pull off. There's a lot of gotchas inside the framework that we navigate around, but it's a whole different ballgame to say, try and implement things like style encapsulation and dead code elimination, those kinds of things that people really crave coming from the React world. It's just a whole different set of disciplines that I don't think that, quite frankly, we're totally even technically equipped to solve in the current stack we have. I think that's actually why you see GitHub ultimately writing a lot more React code, is that we have the need for those things. And even having web component experts at GitHub hasn't been enough to get us over the hump of scaling out a non-React stack that solves those problems.
Personally, I hope that that's a yet thing.
Totally.
We haven't gotten the web components yet, but yeah, React ate the web for a while there. It's nice to see that we have options outside of React, but I understand, especially at GitHub scale, potentially not being able to just be we're done with React.
One example of that is styled components. So we use styled components for years. We've recently, I shouldn't say we've eliminated it, but we've moved away from it in our design system and are working to move away from it almost entirely in all of our applications. And that's a technology that I don't want to say it was strictly necessary, but certainly it made a lot of things easier that were not as possible in the platform. We are now using CSS modules, which are closer to the platform. And that's an example of the more status quo improving and allowing us to move away from bespoke React, or what I would call SPA framework specific solutions. And in fact, that's allowed us to do a lot more style reuse across both our React and non-React interfaces.
In my last episode, I had Vova from Evil Martians on, and he was talking a lot about putting Rails in the browser. And I think a lot of what he was envisioning its use for was tutorials instead of, hey, go to your computer outside of the browser and go try this, just an interactive thing there. But do you and your team have any kind of, maybe when Rails in the browser or Ruby WASM like improves to X point, then there's more that opens up for what ViewComponents can do, because we're completely server side now. We don't have enough access to the client? Or is it kind of like that is so far out in the future that it's not even on the radar yet?
I think that to a certain extent, and maybe this actually speaks to how I think about the framework in general at this point, we've kind of drawn a line in the sand when it comes to the complexity we are willing to implement outside of React. And we've put a ceiling in that I think that is very realistic. Because what we were finding is that as you get into incredibly complex dynamic UIs with a lot of, just for example, like our merge box, the bottom of a pull request when it shows all your check statuses, what your permissions are, what the state of the branch is, what your merge target is, incredible amount of complexity, state, dynamic loading, all this asynchronous stuff. That was really, really hard to maintain in a non-React architecture, despite the work of many very smart people over many years doing what they could. It took a ground-up rewrite. Now, to be fair, a ground-up rewrite in the full Rails stack might have also gone pretty well, but the ability for a new engineer to come in and modify that code in React is an order of magnitude better. So what I'm starting to get a feel for is, even with changes to the platform, I still have a gut feeling that there's a certain level of complexity that is going to be a long time before, certainly practically, we can build it without something like React. And what we're finding is, conversely, what is expected in the industry is increasingly falling on the other side of that line. As we make GitHub more modern and more app-like, the experiences we want to build are disproportionately falling in that land where React becomes a clearer and clearer optimal architecture for what we're trying to deliver to our customers. So I struggle to think about what it would take to get that far. Now, I see applications that are powered by Hotwire. Hey is one example, really great application. And I really appreciate the velocity that developers get, especially on small teams. I mean, that's what Rails is built for. But what we're finding is that especially over the long term, is you have to maintain those things, make them accessible, avoid visual regressions. We have state machines that test that merge box and visually regress it and all this cool stuff. And that's very hard to do. We've tried to do some of that with ViewComponent with Lookbook. But I mean, it really comes down ultimately to functional purity. Like a React component is the function of the state you give it, versus when you're working in a lot of these Rails paradigms, whether it's exclusively your Ruby code that can have access to any of the global state on the server versus React code has none of that on the client. Or if you think about it, similar concept with styles. If you are working in the traditional big blob of CSS setup, you can have as good a discipline as you want, but you're still going to ultimately, especially at our scale, run into these really gnarly kind of just isolation kind of problems. I don't see the story of that meaningfully changing anytime soon. I know we have things like scope styles with web components and whatnot coming up, but those things would still have to become popular for us to then have people who are willing to work on them. Because the other inertia we see with all this is that there's just so much energy going into making the React developer experience great. It is mind-boggling to see how productive people are. And this is getting amplified by AI because TypeScript is strongly typed. So I have a hunch that these LLMs are really able to provide higher quality experiences to developers writing React code in TypeScript. There's also just like a much larger corpus of TypeScript to look at. Now, whether it's a good training set or not, we can debate. But sure. But I see all these factors, kind of socio-technical, like a socio-technical landscape that makes it really hard for me to imagine a place where the web platform is delivering for what GitHub is building today, even like 3 years from now.
Have you seen Drew Bragg's famous red jacket he wears on stage at conferences? Did you know that jacket was dyed with the blood of Node.js developers? Okay, that's not true. But you know what is? JudoScale is the only autoscaler that consistently prevents request timeouts and backed up job queues. It's a better autoscaler because it tracks better metrics, analyzes them more frequently, and is run by a small team of committed devs. JudoScale works with Heroku, Render, Fly, and AWS. Visit judoscale.com to bulletproof your production environment.
Doesn't mean it doesn't, but it's hard to say. I mean, there was a period of time where I'm sure even the idea of web components as we have it now was kind of like, oh, I don't see that being a thing for years and years. And now here we are. And it's like web components still have a ways to go, but they are so much more powerful and so much more useful, I guess. Practical. That's the word I'm looking for. They're so much more practical now than they were a few years ago. So,
and what we're going to find is I think that these platform changes, they raise the bar of how long you can use the platform. And that's kind of what I'm getting at is that like, okay, will we eventually raise the bar to the point where like all of GitHub falls below that bar? And then we get into like hybrid application problems where it's like, okay, do we really want to have two stories for front end at the company when we have hundreds, if not 1,000 engineers working on our product? Do we really want to have to teach them two very different ways? Because the other tricky part about this is that like it'd be one thing if it was these technologies layered on each other, but they're so philosophically different. And this is like another core thing with the ViewComponent framework that's been so tricky is that we are both trying to take the best parts of React and bring them back to Rails while also not breaking mental models in a way that's confusing. We don't want to try and do things that fundamentally don't map to Ruby. What I found is that we went through this thread for a while where we were trying to keep a common core, including potentially with web components in between our React and ViewComponent implementations of our design system. And what ended up happening is that you just had the worst of both worlds because you had the common denominator. It's like if you only had to cook with ingredients from two different cuisines, the overlap of two different cuisines, but you still had to cook in both cuisines, but only with that intersection of the Venn diagram. You'd make really bad food of both cuisines. And someone would come and like look at cuisine A or cuisine B and be like, oh, this is an insult to like the spirit of this food. So I think that's what you see. It's like, okay, if we're going to use React, let's use it to its fullest potential. And I think that as soon as you start looking at these compatibility layers, you have to be really careful of what you're taking off the table. And that goes also from the Rails direction back to React. We were even looking at how do we architect components? Say we had like a complex view component. Well, we tried to like architect it the same way in React. And then we had some compromises there. And the problem is that those differences started to affect even how we did styling in JavaScript. And that got really messy. Then it's like, okay, as soon as they diverge enough, you then have to audit them for accessibility in a completely separate manner because you can't guarantee that they're having even the same APIs, whether under the hood or in the way like a user interacts with them.
Yeah, there's quite a bit that goes in there. And I'm sure at GitHub's scale, it's like to a degree that I can't even fathom. Like I've pretty much predominantly worked on small or smaller teams like GitHub scale. It's kind of like seeing the Grand Canyon for the first time. You're like, I knew what it looked like, but it didn't quite click until I saw it in person.
I think there's an interesting phenomenon though, because I think that there's a certain amount that's trickling down and maybe not in a good way, because some of the reasons we make these decisions don't depend on the scale of the application. Accessibility is a thing I've worked on for years at the company and did a lot of very interesting worked with a lot of great people, very passionate people. And it is amazing to me, the implications of that work on the technical side of things. It's a very real and pressing constraint that required us to do a lot of things that, quite frankly, were hard to justify before accessibility in terms of around, like, say, consistency. Like, how many times as a programmer have you be like, oh, I wish these 100 buttons in our application were all like the exact same code path, the exact same thing. Well, with the accessibility requirements, you kind of don't have a choice because you got to guarantee that your whole application can be used and is consistent and whatnot. So it forces those factors. What I'm seeing in my non-lawyer professional opinion is that that pressure is going to come to more and more companies than is the case right now. And I think that what you'll see is that the way that we solve problems at a GitHub becomes more along the lines of what needs to be done at smaller companies because of that pressure. So, for example, in the last 5 years, 80% of the top 500 e-commerce websites in the world have been sued for an accessibility violation. They've faced actual legal action. That's a lot of lawsuits. So I know y'all are at Podia are in e-commerce. I think this was more like shopping.
A little bit different, but sure.
Digital e-commerce. And I think that what we're going to find is that you're going to be pressured to do more accessibility work, as I think is a good thing for the world. If you have to say, let's just think about this conceptually, as a software engineer, if you're going to need to, through your architecture, guarantee that certain key failure states do not exist, that requires something like a design system with constrained options. I'll just give you a classic example. It's like, okay, how do you guarantee that all of your images have alt text as long as they aren't decorative in your application? If you were to have like a static guarantee, you'd probably lint.
Yeah, maybe some sort of test that would render every view.
Yep.
Something along those lines would be like the first thing that comes to mind. But I'm cheating a little here because I've seen your accessibility talk a few times, and there are tools that help with this.
Right. But that requires you to be able to, in a test, render every single view state, which a more functionally oriented paradigm like React, which is literally state machines for UI, is set up to help you solve, because you can enumerate the state permutations of your application. You look at our design system, and we do this on the Rails side too, to a certain extent. We have what are called sticker sheets, which is literally a matrix of two options on a component. So you might have size on the y-axis and color on the x-axis. And that shows you the permutation of all those combinations for that component. And you can do this across a bunch of different options for a bunch of different components. And you can start to see the actual surface area of all the potential states your design system can be in. Now, imagine if you don't have a design system, you would have to do that for like literally every path through every user interface, every menu, to make sure, say, for example, that when you focus on any single thing with your keyboard, it has sufficient focus outline. That's a key thing we've been doing in our product. And getting to that level of confidence is very hard without a lot of browser-based system tests in the Rails side of things.
When you are at breaks in production, you want to quickly understand and fix it, not sift through logs for the next hour. That's where Honeybadger comes in. Honeybadger notifies you of errors, outages, and performance issues as they occur, and helps you respond instantly when your systems go down. When you need to dig deeper, Honeybadger's advanced query engine helps you reach into your logs and grab just the information you need. With error tracking, performance and uptime monitoring, log management, and support for over 10 languages, Honeybadger is the best tool to gain real insight into your application's health and performance. Best of all, it's free to get started, and setup takes less than 5 minutes. Be sure to check out honeybadger.io. That's www.honeybadger.io. And thank you to Honeybadger for their continued support of the show.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. You brought it up in your intro. You just brought it up a few times, so it feels like a good time to ask about the accessibility work that you've done at GitHub. Is the accessibility work that you've done at GitHub an ongoing thing still, or is your move to the Ruby architecture team kind of maybe moving it into someone else's playground a little bit?
Right. Like any huge initiative, it has different phases and different milestones. And part of the reason I moved elsewhere in the company is that we had reached a point of operational maturity, not maturity in the outcomes, but we had the tools and processes to execute well. I can't share any specific metrics or anything like that, but I can say that the program continues to meet significant further milestones after I left my time on the team. And it's really impressive to see that GitHub is continuing to invest in those things. It does become a evergreen thing because new UI is being built. So like, for example, we started the project before Copilot was the thing. So now there's a whole new world of AI accessibility. And I haven't really been a part of that, but making sure that as we're building, especially new experiences that are unfamiliar and novel, that people who are using assistive technology can still get the same value out of them.
Interesting. I hadn't even thought about Copilot as something that would need the accessibility. That is very interesting that you'd have this accessibility initiative and then a new product like Copilot gets added and like a whole new world opens up for that initiative that you probably couldn't have even foreseen when the initiative first started.
Exactly. Anytime there's a novel UI, like the example I like to give people is that part of the reason we use design systems is to make it so that our resources are available for when something comes up that isn't typical. If we were having to have our accessibility designers and engineers work on every new page, even if that page wasn't that different from another one, we wouldn't have the resources to say, go work on a new novel AI thing. Because what we found is that for these new novel UIs, you have to think about accessibility from day one, because otherwise you're going to go in a direction that you might not be able to retrofit a good assistive technology experience on top of it.
Interesting. Hadn't thought about that. So tell me a little bit about the work that you said you've been on for a few months. So I don't know if it's work that you've done or if it's work that you're going to do with being on the Ruby architecture team at GitHub.
Sure. So the team has a couple responsibilities. One of them is keeping Ruby and Rails at GitHub up to date to head. So we literally have a dashboard that says the number of commits we are behind Ruby and Rails head in production. And that is a key thing because we're such a big code base that we effectively serve as a extension or an annex of the Ruby and Rails test suites. And I think that that's actually something that everyone can do at their companies is they can run, and you can pin the commit. Obviously, you don't have to take every new commit as it lands, although I do that in some places. It's a wild ride. But yeah, we serve as a feedback mechanism because you could imagine the kind of pickle you could end up in as a big code base if something lands upstream that is going to be very expensive or difficult to accommodate in your code base. You want to know about it right away because your ability to influence a potential change upstream is significantly different as time goes on. If we were waiting for an actual gem push from Rails and the thing we want is a breaking change, that gets weird. But we could get in and make that change before it gets out to Ruby gems. And that allows us to have that kind of impact. So it's basically the team of people that are Ruby and Rails experts at the company. And we kind of follow that pattern. We also do things that are investments in the language. So for example, we look at performance related things. We're working on ZJIT with our friends at Shopify. But also on the Rails side, there's this kind of broader evergreen initiative as well to make our Rails app boring because it's not in our interest to maintain custom logic on top of things that are of Rails concern. So this is a story that's been told publicly for many years. Eileen Duchatel has told it well around. There are just so many things, for example, didn't exist in the community when they were first built at GitHub. Like we did some things around background jobs, for example. We've done some things around databases that were not in Rails, but we're not in the business of those things. So we need to be, as best as possible, moving them upstream. And it's good for all the other usual good open source reasons too. Like it's great for us to be able to share our experience of things that can run it, that can serve 10 billion requests a day or whatever we serve. If it can work for us, it should work for everyone if it's a technical thing.
That is super cool. And so you brought up your friends at Shopify. How much overlap is there or how much coordination and cooperation between the teams? Like I'm sure there's a lot of overlap in like, we want to work on X, they want to work on X. Is there a lot of communication between you guys saying like, we're going to work on MySQL, you guys can take Postgres when it came to like, I don't know. I was using those as an example, potentially a bad one. I think you get the point.
Yeah, there's some projects we collaborate on and we do it across a bunch of different venues. I'm still getting a feel for it, but for example, we have like the Trilogy database adapter that's now open source. So like that's not strictly done privately, but I know that the thing is I lose track of which Slack channels are where, but there are some Slack channels that I have that are just with Shopify people that are between GitHub and Shopify. And this is common, I know, just generally in the big Rails community, is that we're all on Slack. So there's some Slack Connect things that go on. Have you ever used Slack Connect?
Yeah, a little bit.
It's where you have
some outside. Yeah.
But it's where you can like link workspaces. You can say, okay, this channel exists both in maybe Gusto and Shopify might have one. It's just like Gusto Shopify. And it's like a little pair.
We hear a lot about the work that Shopify does. They're very vocal about it. I feel like maybe to a degree, GitHub's a little less vocal about the work they do, but certainly you guys being as big of a Rails app as you are, there's a lot of work that goes on. And I know that when I've met folks at GitHub, they talk about some of the work that they do. It's just not as public facing, I feel like. Is that something that's intentional, or is it just kind of like not what we do? You know, I know Ufuk is one of the head managers on the Ruby on Rails infrastructure team at Shopify, and he's fairly vocal. I didn't know if that was just an artifact of him being there, or if GitHub just takes the stance of like, yeah, we're less public about the work that we do. Or it could just be me not seeing it, not having the right people in my timeline.
I think that what you're seeing with Shopify's investment in the Ruby on Rails community is extraordinary and is something to be recognized. And I think that I'm impressed at the amount of resources they're able to dedicate it to it. It's really incredible. My understanding is that they're a much bigger company than us. And I can tell you some of my mental model things because I can't really speak too much to the company priorities because I don't think there's anything that's like hugely intentional either way in what you're observing. But one of the ways I think about it is that our products are somewhat different in their traffic patterns. I would guess that Shopify sees an even greater pressure for, say, per core request efficiency than we do because they're serving e-commerce traffic on Black Friday. Our traffic is a much simpler, very predictable level, and it's mostly logged in. And there's a whole dynamic to that versus like, I think that you just might see just a lot of different engineering dynamics going on. I would still say that we push Ruby on Rails to the limit in our own way, but it's just different.
Yeah, it was just something I had noticed. I didn't know if there was something you knew, insider knowledge that you might have. So this is a loaded question because you've got so many things. You've got ViewComponents and the accessibility work of the past and the Ruby architecture stuff coming up, and a kid, which I don't want to call your child a blocker, but certainly could fall into like, what kind of blockers do you have as far as like, hey, I'm getting ready for paternity leave and that requires me to do the V4 release. What are the kinds of blockers that you're dealing with, or what's one recently that you want to kind of get into?
I think that talking about the major release is a really interesting one because what I found fascinating is that it's put me in like a Semver mindset. It's made me really internalize the true philosophical implications of following Semver, which is that your practices as a software engineer feed into that dynamic. And what I mean by that is that one of the things I've really noticed working on the project for so long is that Semver and Agile, to a certain extent, those mindsets encourage certain types of outcomes. So for example, I don't know about you, but I fear major releases. They are both a great thing and a terrible thing. Like there's a lot of pressure to get them right. If you truly follow Semver, which we try on ViewComponent, it's your chance to do something breaking, to give people work. And what it's made me realize as I've had time to reflect on these kinds of changes that are possible is how our day-to-day leads to what I call like Semver pressure or like angst. And one example of that is that, well, Agile and Semver encourage you not to break things. And Agile encourages you to just go to the next logical step. Well, after 7 years of doing that, wouldn't you hope that you learned how to do something better the next time around? You end up in a bit of a hole. And some of these holes you obviously can't dig yourself out of. Like we have thousands of components at GitHub. We're not going to make any hugely massive changes. But like even something simple like configuration options, try not to have a ton of them. We got rid of some of them in V4. But even we had started adding configuration options, and it only in this release, when I took a step back to look at all of them, did I realize which ones were misleading, unnecessary, or just poorly named or organized. So we basically ended up with like two categories of configuration. One is for generators, which I've never used a Rails generator in my life, which I respect that people do, but I've never used one. I like to write it myself. And then the second was for previews. I think we ended up with like 8 or 9 configuration options. Only one of them was top level. The other ones were not production related. But if you were reading the list that had come out of our like agile iterative way, you would have no clue of knowing whether those configuration options were of consequence or not. So Semver creates a fear of what I would call like fully refactoring something to be correct. And I think this is a big difference between library and framework development and application development. Like imagine if you Semvered GitHub's internal code. Every single release would be breaking, right?
Yeah.
So it's a huge mindset shift to go from that to like, I'm going to make a breaking release once every 2 years. In part, it's because you're breaking other people's apps. I view it as an immense responsibility to not do something undue. But it makes you realize how much we like lean on our ability to change things in a breaking way as an application developer when you can't do it.
That makes sense. I've run into a handful of gem updates where it's a minor version. This should be safe, and it breaks something. And I'm just like, you words I don't want to say because I don't want to put the explicit content warning on my show. This is not a major change. You should not have broken anything. Meanwhile, like in my app development stuff, I'm just like, whatever. We'll just change it everywhere. It's fine.
We'll do a maintenance window.
Yeah, like no one needs to worry about this. If it's not our API, it's fine.
What it's really opened my eyes to is like, how do you guarantee it? I think that as we're seeing more LLM generated code, where does your confidence come from on this? Like I've run into the trap of you writing little scripts and whatnot that had bugs in them, but because I didn't write it, I think I was way less likely to see it. And I've started to envy the folks in the statically typed side of things, the compiled side of things a little bit more. Started to envy the folks who write Elm a little bit more. I believe they guarantee no runtime errors.
Joel Quinville loves Elm. I've heard him talk a lot about it. I have not played with, but I'm familiar with just because of listening to the Bike Shed.
Right. Those are the kinds of things that in this moment of reflection of taking on a major release that I start to wonder about. And we're starting to see this kind of generally with even writing Ruby at GitHub. I think that a lot of the code we write goes a long time without being changed. So we don't learn the lessons of changing code. And I think this is especially true in the Rails field because Rails is the one-person framework. Lots of prototyping happens in Rails and whatnot. I think that as you get into that realm of having to go back and make big changes like we have, say, for accessibility or just like sweeping product changes, you start to see where your confidence comes from as a software engineer. And especially writing like a framework in Ruby, it's wild to be like, oh my gosh, I'm changing this thing. And I know we have a very thorough test suite. We've had 100% code coverage from day one, even branch coverage. But I still am worried. We've made some fairly significant changes under the hood in this release. We haven't really had to change any test cases. It's not like they've been breaking changes in the tests. It still makes you wonder because we don't have those guarantees in our world, in our Ruby ecosystem.
I mean, even if you do have those quote unquote guarantees in like TypeScript or whatever, it being statically typed. So you still got any. That's a type that I'm sure that gets abused. Like, I don't mean to say like, oh, Ruby's better than TypeScript or the same because of that. It just comes down to a little bit of craftsmanship.
But you can say no any.
Right.
We use linters to a certain extent to file down the sharp edges in Ruby and Rails. I would guess if you look even at Rubicop, you'll see some signs of that sprinkled throughout. Even just like Rubicop performance, like there are things that like they might not explicitly be dangerous, but they might be slow, and we lint against those.
Not quite to the level of a compiler, but the improvements that Ruby has seen over the past couple of years, especially in things like the Ruby LSP and just improvements to how we generate AST of Ruby code, like it's unlocking some really awesome things that is going to make the whole experience of writing Ruby that much better and hopefully get us closer to what you're kind of hoping or wishing that we had to a degree. I mean, it will certainly never get to the statically typed language safety, maybe it would be the right, but I think there's a lot of improvement in getting some of that danger. You're doing something potentially bad.
What I wonder though is if, to kind of go back to something I said earlier about like the common denominator of ingredients between two different cuisines, I do wonder whether we are at the same time as we make Ruby quote unquote better in those ways, making it worse for what it actually should be. Because on the flip side, we've done a lot of that work at GitHub, and I would say that I generally feel mixed about it. I see why we have to do it, but it certainly makes it feel less like the language I fell in love with. And that is a reality of the scale, but I can see how there is some hesitation in the Ruby community to add a lot of these things that ostensibly make it safer and more predictable, because I've seen some Ruby code that is very safe and predictable that makes me want to learn Go. Because I'm like, well, if we're going to go this direction, is it better to take something that is elegant and beautiful and flexible and put it in handcuffs? Or is it better to go use a tool that was built with that in mind? And this is a kind of an existential debate, I think, that I'm having with colleagues around the company. How far do we want to push the language and the framework to do things that take it further away from what it might generally be good at or what it should be good at in a very like philosophical sense? Because these things are all technically possible. Like, we're engineers, we can build just about anything. We could slowly, over many years, turn Ruby literally into Go. You could just one breaking change at a one Christmas release at a time. We could converge into Go. It would take time.
Could we not? That'd be great.
but
yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, we're on that path. So it's like, how far do you want to take it?
I think for me, at least, the thing I like is that most of these guardrails, most of these improvements that make it a little bit safer, a little bit nicer to work in, they're like add-ons. The Ruby LSP is not Ruby, right? It is a completely separate tool. The Prism parser is in Ruby, but it doesn't actually do anything. It just gives you the ability to do more safety-esque things with Ruby, right? It improves how Rubocop can work. It improves how the LSP looks at and is more can find errors in our code and whatnot. But if you want the pure joy of writing Ruby like you had before any of these things, like, you just turn them off. And then you're back to just, I can write my 10,000 line Ruby script of chaos because I can and I want to, and it's a personal project and no one else will ever see it. And I like that. I like the fact that I can still do my weird Ruby stuff. But when I'm working at work and I need some more safety and I'm dealing with thousands of files and stuff I've never touched or hasn't been touched in years, and the person who wrote it left 5 years ago as it is, now we have tools that help us. It's not the same as a statically typed language per se would be, where we can like click on something and find every iteration of it. But even some of the new stuff in the LSP where it can guess receivers. And as long as your naming conventions are good, like, it does a really good job. The guest receivers.
It's quite good. And I think you're having me see it more as like separate dialects of the same language, where it's like you have this safe Ruby dialect or sorbet Ruby dialect is like I sometimes see it. And those things can coexist. I think that what I see happening kind of maybe even beyond the language is that people then start to compare it to be like, okay, we're doing this in Ruby. Is this still the language we want in this situation? I feel ultimately torn about it. I think that it is kind of interesting because it probably extends the runway pretty significantly for the language. And I think that it's very pragmatic. I think that while we do see a lot of benefits, we occasionally will take a service at work and rewrite it in Go because it's just way better suited for the language.
To that point, though, I would argue that getting it built in Ruby first was the right call, because you're just going to move faster.
And even if you rewrote it, it'd probably see a lot of the performance benefits too. What I try to avoid in these kinds of debates is making them technical, because these things are not technical decisions. There's people and systems involved. we found that certain types of services and languages and whatnot are easier to deploy in our infrastructure and whatnot. It's easier to hire for. And I think that that's where just seeing the different forms Ruby can take is pretty wild, because it can kind of shapeshift now into these different modes.
Yeah, it is very cool. It's exciting. You are going to lose a little bit of what made Ruby so wonderful, like just the ability to do whatever, no guardrails, sharp knives kind of thing. But it's a maturity thing, right? When we were teenagers, we also did a lot of dumb stuff that, like, yeah, we miss it, but also like it hurts now to do some of those things the next morning. So maybe we don't do those. We've matured. We could talk about this for a whole nother episode.
I think it's funny you say that, because the GitHub monolith is what, 17, 18 years old or whatever at this point. So you're like, your analogy tracks well, that to a certain extent, these things, I mean, it's a real testament that the GitHub monolith has remained Ruby on Rails for as long as it has. It's taken countless hours of work by so many smart people to do that, but we're still here, and it's going to be around for a long time. And I think that that's where you really learn the implications of your decisions as an engineer, is when your stuff sticks around. And I think that that's kind of the thing that I feel super privileged about ultimately in my position, is that, like, I have gotten to see ViewComponent exist for 6 years. I've learned so much about the consequences of my decisions, versus if I had job hopped, every 2 years, I would have never seen even the 2-year consequences, let alone the 4 or the 6-year ones. To a certain extent, if I stick around long enough, I might be the person who removes it as a dependency from GitHub. I don't know. I don't think that'll ever happen. But it's the kind of thing where I think the longer you are around, the better lessons you learn as an engineer, and it helps you make way better decisions day to day.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Because again, we could talk about all of this stuff forever. We're going to use my guardrails. We're going to move to the next question, which I'm sure will also yield lots of discussion. But what is something cool, new, or interesting that you've recently learned, discovered, read, whatever? It doesn't have to be coding related. I've had people talk about endangered hobbies and cloud whitening, and book series I'm currently addicted to was one of them, which I don't know how I feel about it yet, because I've spent so much time reading the series. But it can be. We've also had people talk about Ruby WASM and things that are coming out in Ruby, or that they're building with Ruby that are super exciting, or that they just found. So for you, in all the various things that you're involved with, what is something cool, new, or interesting that you want to share?
As part of my onboarding under the Ruby architecture team, one of the key things I was told was to go read Ruby Under a Microscope, with the disclaimer that Ruby Under a Microscope is out of date.
It's still a great read, though.
It's 1819. I'm only maybe 10% of the way through. But I think that if you've been in Ruby, I feel like you should be automatically mailed that book when you enter like the 4th year of working in Ruby, because you just should know. Like, I'm reading this stuff and I'm like, I've seen these terms. It helps me understand at a fundamental level what some of the error messages I've gotten really meant over the years. And I mostly understood. Now I can deeply understand how Ruby actually takes a text file and turns it into tokens, and then takes those tokens and turns it into machine code, and like the kind of like fundamental process that if you watched every single Aaron Patterson keynote, you'd probably get the same education. He did write the foreword for the book, so it makes sense. But yeah, that definitely would be my recommendation. It's a really solid read. I can only handle so much. I read like 3 pages right before bed, and it's like, okay, well, I'm definitely going to sleep well tonight.
It's a very technical book. And I feel like I agree. I'm the same way with my technical reading. I can read like a chapter of a technical book, and then I'm like, that's enough for now. With my readings for fun, I can read like, oh, it's been 3 hours. I'm still not done reading yet. But yeah, with technical, it's just like, I only have so much capacity. Exactly. But yes, Ruby Under a Microscope is a great recommendation. Good call.
It makes me wonder if there's a Rails Under a Microscope. Having worked on ViewComponent, I could probably write the one on Action View Under a Microscope, written in blood. Oh my gosh, the lessons I've learned about Action View. But I think that writing one for all of Rails would be deeply fascinating. I think there's a couple people on the current or former core team members I think could write a really interesting read there.
I would read that book too. It is interesting, especially like there was a point in my career where I noticed myself going into the Rails source code to debug something in my own application, and just starting to go down those layers was such an interesting journey, and seeing what was actually happening for the stuff that I had just been using. Like I didn't actually know what was going on. Once I started getting into the source code, completely changed a lot of what I thought about with Rails and like the mental models I had. So reading a book like that, where it's a little more structured and organized instead of just me spelunking, would be awesome.
Totally, yeah, because these lessons are hard to learn when you're debugging. When you're bundle opening, when you put your first binding.pry in a gem, yeah. Yeah.
We don't use pry at Podia anymore. We're using just binding IRB.
Yes, I do too, yeah.
But Copilot does not fucking understand that. Well, I guess I'm putting the explicit content on now. Oh, well. Copilot does not understand this. And if I type binding and it is like, oh, you mean .pry. And I'm like, no, stop it. How many times do I have to type? How many times do I have to type binding.irb before it will learn I want binding.irb? Do you know? Because you work at the place.
Time to put it in a system prompt or something like that. Yeah. I hear you.
All the AI stuff is fascinating. The way that it looks at code and analyzes code, the way that it writes code. I don't think I've gotten to the same level of trust as a lot of people have with it, but it is really interesting.
Yeah, I'd say I'm in a similar spot. I've been spending more time doing it as I start to wind down ahead of paternity leave. I'm having a little more time to play around with it. I think it's really cool. I think especially if you're building an application, I see it really good for kind of building something that's already been built or writing scripts. It's a great one. Like I had a script to write the other day and I just prompted it. I was not looking forward to writing that script and it got it. It did it.
The landscape's changing. I don't think our jobs are as in jeopardy as some of the AI folks would have us feel like our jobs are in jeopardy. But yeah, the landscape is changing for sure.
Yeah, agreed.
Cool. So I want to respect your time. Is there anything else that you want to talk about with the release coming up, with anything that we've touched on, anything else that we didn't go deep enough into? I'll be on here with you for 3 more hours if you wanted to, but you are a busy man, so you tell me.
Any and all feedback on the ViewComponent release would be super helpful. We've been doing alpha releases for a while that I know some people have been integrating, but getting it integrated as soon as possible, even just on a branch to run against your CI. Like I said earlier, the way we treat Rails upstream, the sooner you report a bug, the more likely it is to be able to get the best fix in. So if you wait, I might be on paternity leave when you run into that bug, and there's other people who are going to be working on the project. I'm not worried. But this is a great time to be involved and test out the release and let us know how it goes.
And so where can people find you and whatever projects you want them to find on the internet?
My website is hawksley.org. I don't do any social media or anything.
And viewcomponents.org.
Viewcomponent.org, yep.
Version 4 RC1 is out. What is the goal timeline?
So today's the 30th, Monday. We'll probably have RC2 later this week, I would guess. There's a thing or two we want to toss in. I'm taking a week off to go on vacation. And if I come back to no open issues, I will ship V4, which I think would be the Monday. Yeah, it'd be 2 weeks from today. So 14th, something like that.
Right after the old Rails Conf in Philadelphia. Very cool. Speaking of conferences, will you be at Rocky Mountain Ruby later in October?
I will be. Love that we now have a great conference in town. It's like, I could almost bike there from my house. It's so great. Yeah.
Boulder is such a cool city to have a conference in. So walkable, so much cool stuff going on around it. Spike and team have a great venue and awesome conference. Looking forward to it.
Same.
Cool, man. Thank you so much for coming on, talking a little bit about ViewComponents and all the work that you're doing at GitHub. It was well overdue having you on the show, so I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And listeners, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.